We have Richard Sanchez joining us, and he's going to be discussing the role of the VFX editor. Richard, let's see if you're there with us. Bring you on. Excellent.
Hello.
Hey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
When I first talked to Richard about being in our meeting, we had so many interesting things to talk about. He's full of incredible information. So I asked if we could feature him in a blog article. If you go to lappg.com/blog, you'll read all about Richard. You'll find out how he got interested in editing, and you'll find out what he thinks makes are like successful skills for assistant editors to have. And also he talks about being part of the crew that did the remote workflow for Bill and Ted Face the Music. So Woody and I just watched the film over the weekend. And
oh yeah, what'd you think?
We loved it. It was so much fun. And I'm so interested to hear what you have to say about the VFX shots and all of that. So yeah. I won't take up any more time. I'm going to let you run with it. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you. What I really wanted to take time to talk about is I still find, despite the fact that there's no longer a such thing as a non-visual effects film in Hollywood anymore, the role of the visual effects editor is still largely misunderstood by a variety of people. And I kind of wanted to take time to dive into what the job is and what the job isn't. And I'll preface it by saying this will probably be the least sexy presentation of VFX you've ever seen, but I think it's a really important one. We've all seen those great, and there's a multitude of these great tutorials on how to turn your face into a monster or make fire out of your hands, and those are awesome, and I love them. And this, I want to kind of prepare people for what it is that you'll be asked of when you take on the role of the VFX editor. And so just diving in, I figured we'd start with some common misconceptions. And the first one, I got this recently when someone was asking to hire a VFX editor, is that the VFX editor creates the VFX shots. You kind of, but not really. The VFX editor is going to create temp comps, but not typically for final. It's worth noting that sometimes the VFX editor's comps will go to final, though this is usually in very rare circumstances, usually due to very tight deadlines. If you have a preview that you're rushing to get to, and we know that it's not the final shot, of course temps will make it into the preview because you just need something to show an audience and certainly to show your producers. But again, this is more likely to occur in television than in film because film has very rigid requirements, usually in the form of EXRs with mattes, and you need to preserve color range for very detailed color correction. This isn't to say that a television online isn't also very detailed, but you can get away with a little bit more than you can in a feature. Another big one is that a VFX editor needs to know After Effects. And it's a really important thing to know is that sometimes a VFX editor will work with After Effects or Nuke, or if you're one of these incredibly skilled editors, your Alan Bells I'm talking about, who know 3D software and do these amazing things, there's a world that you can do. But at its heart, I know of some amazingly skilled VFX editors who do their job entirely in Avid, don't touch After Effects at all. In fact, one who I'm thinking of works on the highest level A+ films. You've 100% seen the films this guy has done, does not touch After Effects, and it doesn't change the fact that he is one of the most skilled visual effects editors out there today. The heart of the job is really all about preparing materials that's going to go to the vendors for them to do the final job, and you're keeping track of the cut as it changes because entropy is the name of the game in post, and someone needs to be there to track all of those changes, make sure that the vendors are up to date, make sure that the notes that the director wants are being received, are being understood, any additional assets are getting over to them. If you're working on a show that has less resources, there might just be a visual effects editor and that's it. And so it can be a little difficult to get in with regards to that. Now, that said, I've also seen shows that will call it the visual effects assistant editor, but they're really the only one working. So in essence, they are the visual effects editor. And so it can be a little difficult at times to discern which one is which. Typically, the answer is if you're a visual effects assistant editor and you're working for a visual effects editor, then you actually are a visual effects assistant editor. And if you're a visual effects assistant editor and you're not working for a visual effects editor, you're being asked to be a visual effects editor. So now that we have that distinction out of the way, I mean, the most common way, the way I learned visual effects was being an assistant editor. It was a matter of, we didn't have a visual effects editor, so I had to learn how to track this stuff myself. And so it was a matter of reaching out to friends. Hey, what the heck is a count sheet? You know, and what do I get? And from there, you know, you start simple, because if you're being asked to handle all of that load as an assistant editor and not with the specialty of a visual effects editor, one would hope that the needs are not overbearing. That said, that doesn't stop people from asking you anyway. But being an assistant editor is how I kind of gradually found my way into that job. But you can look for visual effects assistant editor jobs. There's a lot of terminology and concepts that were really foreign to me when I started as a VFX editor. And I just want to kind of share some of these with you so that if you're ever in the situation where you're taking on this kind of a job, that you don't end up perhaps stone-faced as I was the first time I heard some of these. And the first thing is a bidding QuickTime, which is very simple in concept. It's QuickTime of an individual shot or series of shots that's used by the vendor to determine cost. And here's an example of how I typically lay out bidding QuickTimes before I send them out. The one thing is, when you're kicking out something like a reference QuickTime to a vendor, you'll typically put a shot on either side for context, but in the case of a bidding QuickTime, I never include context. They literally just need to see the shot that I'm asking them to work on. So in this case here, you can see there are some single shots followed by a second of black, and then where we have several adjacent shots, it goes shot, 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 because if they're butted up against each other, there's no reason to break them out. For security purposes, I typically don't include sound on these, and you can see the example on the right here is a look at the composer window. I'm pretending that I'm working on a Star Wars film because I always wanted to work on one. So you can see I put the work order at the bottom, green screen, Mos Eisley spaceport, and then up top I have the visual effects shot number, SWM, which stands for Star Wars movie, and Mos Eisley 1, and then shot number 1020. So you're laying this out to your vendor so they can then come back to you and say, okay, this is how much this shot is going to cost, and it'll take X amount of time, blah, 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 blah. And you can see I have all of my watermarks. I'm bidding this to ILM, and it's property of the studio. It's all watermarks to high heaven because we got to be safe here. Next thing I want to talk about is these guys. You might have seen these if you've assistant edited on a show, but if you haven't had to turn these over, I know the first time I saw these, I wondered, what the heck are they? What do they do? Well, the guy on the right is the chrome ball, and the chrome ball is held up in front of the camera, and they're reflective, and the purpose of them is when you have a 3D character insertion or a 3D environment, you need to have a 3D rigger who's going to, or not a rigger, a 3D lighting artist. He's going to recreate the lights, and this allows him or her to see the lights wherever they are on set, to recreate that lighting scheme, because your 3D characters or 3D environments need to be lit the same way that your actors are, and everything needs to match. So that's the purpose of those. They're typically only required if you're going to do a 3D character or a 3D environment, but I have had situations where I was working on 2D comps where they wanted them as well, so it's kind of one of those things where I go, okay, if you want it, I'll hand it to you. And the guy on the right is a gray ball, and similarly to the chrome ball, they also track light, but they're non-reflective. They show how shadow is going to fall off based on the position of the camera versus the lights. And it's worth noting, typically, if you're being really strict about it, you do want to show up chrome balls and gray balls anytime the camera moves or anytime the lighting setup changes. But sometimes they just don't have time, and you'll get a note from your data wrangler, your visual effects data wrangler, who will say, just use the light balls from this other setup. And it's an imperfect way of doing it, but it certainly happens because time is also one's enemy in any shooting situation. This guy, what the heck is that? That is a lens grid. And the purpose of a lens grid, you'll typically be turning these over early on in the process, long before shots have started coming in. This is just kind of one of those things that your vendor needs. And the purpose of these is you'll get one per lens, and not just per lens, but per serial number of lens. For example, if you use 3 different 50mm lenses, you'll break them up by serial number because no 2 pieces of glass are ever exactly the same. And by using these light grids, your vendors can then use that to map out the lenses of the digital cameras that they're using in 3D characters, and for 3D characters and 3D environmental builds. And that's what those are. And this could be a pretty labor-intensive task. I worked on a project where we had a good about 80 or 90 of these that I had to turn over. And so this is one of those tasks. Sometimes they want different durations. Sometimes they want different setups or different zoom lengths. So that's what a lens grid is. And award as a concept is very simple. When a shot is bid and you've given it to a vendor, it's considered awarded. And so, for example, you might have a bid of 40 shots, but you might actually only award 20 of those to one vendor, and you'll award the other 20 to a different vendor. So awarded refers to when you've given a shot to a vendor. The first time I heard that term, I had no idea what it meant. The hero plate is the main plate of a shot. Typically has the hero in the plate, and in the case of a really simple shot, the hero plate might be the only plate. Sometimes you're painting something out. If it's a vanity fix or a suit fix, we had some suit fix paint outs in Bill and Ted. You might just have just the hero plate. And a V0, the first time I heard the term V0, I had no idea what they're talking about. The V0 is going to be the tool that you will use to check the color pipeline. And what happens with the V0 is when you first turn over a shot, before any work is done, they'll send it back to you, and they'll include the CDL that you sent to them and the LUT that you sent to them. And sometimes if there's a speed change on the plate before the work gets done, they'll apply that speed change and send it back to you. The purpose of the V0 is before they start doing a lot of work, especially something labor intensive like roto, they're going to send the plate to you to go, does the color look as you're expecting? And is the frame range as you're expecting? And this will usually include the handles that you're expecting back, because this is supposed to be representative of what the shot is with no work done to it. And these are really important in making sure that your color pipeline is correct. If your color pipeline is correct, you'll have a pretty good experience. But if it isn't, you can get into a painful experience. The term that I often hear confused often is PreViz, and PreViz is often confused for PostViz, and PreViz is typically done before shooting happens. It's often done by a separate PreViz company, not necessarily the VFX editor, although a VFX editor might modify certain things within it. And I say crude 3D imagery with no intended insult to the 3D imagery that's done nowadays, because some of the things with Unreal Engine are absolutely staggering. But it's intended to inform production how to shoot a shot, how to shoot a scene. If you're going to have a massive sequence that's going to be nearly entirely blue screen, you need to have some way to map what angles you need, what kind of shots you need, and the way you'll do that is having a PreViz sequence that simulates the end result. Typically, the PreViz sequences will be given to the editor once the editor is brought on, once shooting starts, because, like all sequences, that could change even if it was decided and approved in PreViz. And over time, the PreViz shots will get replaced with the final visual effects shot until you're left with the epic battle at the end of Avengers Endgame. And PostViz, again, PostViz is just the temp comps that you're doing by the VFX editor. It's called PostViz because it's done after shooting. And I bring this one up because I once embarrassed myself working on a film when I had an editor ask me, do you have a PostViz team? And I said, no. And he goes, oh, what are those guys over there doing? Comps? I was like, oh, yeah, I guess that's what they are. So PostViz. You're working with the plates that have been shot. It's done to quickly illustrate what a shot looks like. It's a temp comp. Cutback as a concept is something that I only learned recently. What this means is if you have a shot that's derived of a long single take, for example, if there are two people talking back and forth, what a cutback is instead of pulling that as two shots, you pull it as one long shot. And then you give it to the vendor and they work on it as one shot and you cut it up into two pieces. You cut back to it, hence cutback. And here's an example of what that is. You can see on the left, if you have 5 shots at the bottom, those are your plates, and up top you have 2 visual effects shots. But in this case, if those are the same take, you can make those as one shot. You give that to the vendor once, and then when you bring it back, you cut it into 2 pieces and lay it in the timeline. And there are pros and cons to this approach. The pro that has been described to me is it's cheaper for the visual effects vendor because they only have to line up the shot once, and lining up a shot for a visual effects artist takes time and costs money. However, the con comes for us as visual effects editors because now we have to track that as 2 separate elements, and I find them little difficult to work with, but it is a fairly common way of working, and actually somewhat controversial depending on who you talk to about it, but it was certainly a concept that I didn't know until very recently. And the term reconcile is a term that I've heard by different names, but I've also heard the term differential or cut count check. What it means when you reconcile a cut, or if you do a differential, is you're going to check every single visual effects shot in the film. And you're going to see what shots have been extended, what shots have been trimmed, what shots have been omitted, and what shots have been added. And it's a tremendous amount of work. Reconciling an entire film could take a day or two. And this is really at the heart of what we do. Keeping track of that is a big part of our job. A count sheet is a document that, in its most basic form, tells you how many frames an intended shot is. You can see this is an example from my code book. I include a lot of extra metadata just to make sure everything is as detailed as possible. But at its heart, what a count sheet is that. It really just lays out, this is the shot number, this is how many frames we have in handle, this is how many frames we have in the cut, and that's what you need, that's what I'm expecting back. You might have heard me use the term lineup. A lineup is a chart that you use to let the vendor know when you take all of your elements and you lay them in a timeline, how do they come together to form the final shot. So in this case, you can see the blue clips there are, I've laid out the cut frame number against the element frame number, and that informs them as to the duration of the shots used to accomplish what I'm doing. But at its heart, this is all a lineup is it's a shot number, and I put the element name. You can see here's TTM 1310 BG3. So in this case, this is a fairly beefy shot, has 5 elements. And I'm just telling the vendor, starting at this frame number to this frame number, that's the first plate of the shot. Starting from this frame number to this frame number, that's the next plate of the shot. Some of us are familiar with the concept of mats, but as it applies to visual effects deliverables, there are different types of mats. There's a Z-depth mat, and there are the most typical RGB mats. What a mat typically is used for is it allows your colorist to color very specific parts of a shot. For example, if you have a green screen shot, you have a character walking and then you have the background. Maybe it's the future. And so your future can be color corrected separately from your character plates. And that can be really important because depending on how the key was done, you want to make sure you can bring the lighting of the digital environment and the plate into the right color space. And FFOC, LFOC, those are abbreviations, stands for first frame of cut and last frame of cut. It's just a way of describing where your visual effects shot starts and where the visual effects shot ends. And it's a fairly common abbreviation, so the first time I saw that, I had no idea what it meant. With regards to shots incoming, or if we're talking about plate names, if we're talking about plate names, there's a variety of different ways. Like, for example, BG, background, FG, foreground. are common ways of denoting a plate. For me, I tend to usually call my plates BG and always number it BG01, BG02, because sometimes BG01 goes away because it just isn't accomplishing what we need to do, so we'll move on to BG02. And I'll also always version every number. So for example, BG01 version 1, if that shot needs to be repulled because it got extended at the tail, then I'll move on to version 2. It's the same plate. The plate itself hasn't changed, but it's a new version because I had to repull it and extend it. I usually use the nomenclature BG, FG, background, foreground. If it's a split screen plate, I'll call LT and RT, left and right. If it's a green screen plate, I like to call it GS. If it's a blue screen, I like to call it BS. I could call it BG if I wanted to, but I like the specificity of the vendor knowing immediately, oh, that's a green screen plate, that's a blue screen plate. And in the case of a ref shot, the gray balls, I'll just call those RF for ref. Just some thoughts and philosophies. And the first one is, I prefer to do my PostViz in Avid if I can help it at all. And the reason for that is, I love After Effects. After Effects is great, but there's nothing very fast about it. And so if you have to revise a shot in After Effects and then you're really under the gun to get a cutout, that can be problematic. So I try to do my temp comps in Avid, which gives the editor the freedom. If they pull out a shot, it gives them the flexibility to do that just with the render, and you're good to go. The other thing is different tools for different situations. Again, this will sort of renege on what I just said, which is there's absolutely a time to use After Effects. And when you're in a situation where you simply need something more robust, then don't be afraid to use something. Don't get locked down into anything philosophically. There's a time to use something more robust, go for it. And the last thing kind of touches on that same concept is I used to avoid third-party plugins, in particular Boris and Sapphire. And the reason was I've worked on projects that are of tough budgets where they wouldn't pay for Sapphire or Boris. And I was always worried that if I became overly dependent on one of these tools, that I'd be in a situation where I couldn't accomplish my work. And that's a valid concern. But that said, going on to Bill and Ted, if I didn't use Boris Continuum Complete, there's no way I could have gotten my work done. And so be open to the more specific tools that will help you get your job done in a more efficient way.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm going to hop in here now. And I just wanted to say we learned so much from you tonight. Thank you, thank you. We have more questions. I'm going to see if there's any way I can get those to you, and maybe you can shoot me out some answers and I can get them to the people. But
great.
Very informative. We're getting lots of great stuff. And also, I just wanted to mention, for those of you who aren't familiar with Master the Workflow, check that out online. There's lots of great stuff they're doing. And also, the VFX terminology sheet will be up on our website for a little while, so make sure you download that. Thanks again, Richard.
Thank you.
If you've missed our meetings in the past, please head to our YouTube channel. We do have our online meetings going up as well, and there are about 65 up there now. So I'm sure there will be something of interest for you to check out. And be sure to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we want to thank our partners. We have some incredible partners that allow us to do this every month. We have Shutterstock as our platinum partner, and we have at our gold level Adobe, Blackmagic, Sony, Vimeo, and Production Hub, and at our silver level OWC, Isotope, and Zeiss. And we also have a bunch of companies that support us through generous giveaways, media support, and community support to help us get the word out about the group. And thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Richard, and you guys have a good night. Bye.